Hi everyone, I'm thriller author J.F.Penn, and today on killerthrillers.com I'm interviewing best-selling and award-winning thriller author Timothy Hallinan. Welcome, Tim.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh no, it's great to have you on the show. So why don't you start by telling us a bit more about you and your writing background?
Okay. Well, I started writing full-time in the 1990s. One of my great disappointments in life was that I didn't write a novel until I was 40.
Oh.
If I had done it at 20 years earlier, I would have written more of them. But I made up for it because the 15th book is coming out next year. I began when I was working 60 hours a week, just writing at night, and I wrote a mystery because it was what I read most, and I thought, you have an intuitive understanding of the rules of the kinds of books you read most. I write because I can't do anything else that occupies me emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. And it gets you on all levels. You know as well as I do, you sort of wrap up everything you've got and try to get it through your fingers onto the screen or the page. And because I honestly don't know what I'd do in life if I didn't do it.
So you mentioned there that, you have to write, but that you started quite late. So what did you do before you were a writer? I'm just fascinated.
When I was in college, I became part of a singing group, a music group. And we also had immediate success that was too early and too easy. Signed a couple of contracts, cut a couple of albums. The group broke up, and two people in it went on to found a group that sold a zillion copies called Bread. And I had a lot of songs on Bread albums, which supported me for a while. And then I put together a company that did something that no one else was doing, which was to say it matched large corporations with quality television. This was at the time when public television was becoming important in America, and a lot of companies wanted to buy television not so much to sell cars, say if it was General Motors, but to make the case that General Motors was a certain kind of corporation. It was a great job. I was living in Los Angeles, New York, and London. I was on planes all the time. And that was when I wrote the first book. It was a good job because I made it up. I created it, and nobody else did it, and so I had a monopoly. But what I really wanted to do was write, so I did.
Yeah, no, and it sounds like creativity in some kind has actually run through your whole life, with the music and creating business. But why don't you tell us a bit about your most recent book?
Okay, I'm going to tell you about two very briefly. I had a book come out in August of last year, which is called The Fame Thief, and I would hold it up if I had thought in advance. And that is the fifth book in a series set in Bangkok about an American travel writer named Poke Rafferty, who goes to Bangkok to write a book, falls in love with the city, which is what happened to me when I first went to Bangkok, and stays. And he discovers that up until then, when he's written these books, he's looked at all the societies he wrote about as though there were a pane of glass in between him and it, as though he were looking at it through a department store window. And for the first time, he has to somehow find a way to get through the pane of glass in order to live in the Thai society, which is very different, and in order to be a good husband and father to the Thai woman he marries and the street child, little girl named Miaow, whom they adopt. So, in this continuing series of books, the family, that little unit of three, is in many ways the leading character. They're always all three involved in the story, except in the one that I'm talking about right now, in which I simply got them out of Bangkok, because otherwise they would have been I got Miaow and Rose, Poke's wife, out of Bangkok, because otherwise they would have become pawns instantly. And what happens in that book is that Poke accidentally gets caught up in one of the little ancillary whirlwinds on the outer perimeter of the war on terror. There's an Islamic insurrection in the south of Thailand. The Americans are very deeply involved, as they are anywhere there are Muslim extremists. And some of the people who are running the American role in the Thai insurrection are the same people who put together a thing called the Phoenix Program in Vietnam, which ran for about 3 years at the end of the war and which killed about 1,200 people a month. It was the first program of sanctioned assassination ever run by the American government. So Poke inadvertently comes up against a guy named Haskell Murphy, who has moved straight from Vietnam into the war on terror. And he's a very serious guy. So that's the first book. It's called The Fear Artist, because that's what Haskell was his entire life. Haskell Murphy was a fear artist. And that came out in August. It got great reviews. It sold okay. And then coming on July the 2nd of this year is a book called The Fame Thief. The Fame Thief is the third in a series of novels. They're mysteries. The Poke books are thrillers. The difference between a thriller and a mystery is a thriller. The central question in a mystery is who done it. And the central question in a thriller is how do you live through it? You usually know who done it relatively early on. So these are mysteries. And in this, and the hero of the Junior Bender series is not entirely coincidentally named Junior Bender. And he is a San Fernando Valley burglar who moonlights as a private eye for crooks. So if someone has just stolen $500,000 in flat screen TVs out of the garage of your modest little house in Van Nuys, you're not going to go to the cops. You're going to go to Junior, because Junior will operate outside the law to solve the crime. These are funny books. I think they're funny. Everybody who reviews them thinks they're funny. There seems to be a consensus that they're funny. And they've done very, very nicely. They've been bought for film and television by Lionsgate. The Pokes have also been bought for film and television. And they're just an enormous amount of fun to write. In this particular book, Junior is hired by the world's oldest, still dangerous gangster, a 93-year-old named Erwin Dressler, who's based on a guy who really was absolutely instrumental in the creation of Los Angeles in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, who just died a couple of years ago. And he's hired not so much to solve a crime as to figure out who, in 1950, so that's 63 years ago, destroyed the career of an up-and-coming movie actress. A woman named Dolores Lamar, who had just been named by Life magazine the most beautiful woman in the world. And what Junior finds out when he goes into this is that there are vendettas that just improve with age. The hatred just gets richer and richer and richer over the decades, and he opens up an absolute Pandora's box of violence. It's a terrific book, I think, okay? because it's the most fun I ever had writing a book in my life.
Oh, that's brilliant. That communicates to the reader as well, doesn't it? But I wanted to, let's come back on the Poke Rafferty thrillers. So a couple of questions there. But first of all, how does that travel? And you mentioned that you love Bangkok. Why were you in Bangkok? Why were you traveling? And why do you love that area so much that you want to set a series there?
Well, in 1985 or something like that, I was in Japan because I had helped put together a documentary for American Public Television about the first tour of Japan by a Western Symphony Orchestra, which in this case was the LA Philharmonic. Pardon me. And I had arranged to take 2 or 3 weeks off. I was going to just loaf around in Japan. But it was the coldest February in 20 or 30 years, and I don't do cold really well. So I called my travel agent, this was back when we had travel agents, and said, put me someplace warm where I don't need a visa. And she said, well, that's either the Philippines or Thailand. And I had been in the Philippines making the worst movie in the history of the world, and I hated every minute of it, although I actually liked the Philippines. I just didn't want to revisit that. So I said Thailand. And I flew to Thailand, and I got off the plane wearing a hat with ear flaps and a foam jacket, and I'm toddling across the airport. And it's 96 degrees out. And all the way across the airport, I can see the immigration guys falling off their stools laughing. And I thought, I had never actually realized that immigration people laughed. I didn't know they possessed that gene. And that was the welcome to Thailand. And I became aware after 4 or 5 days there that the muscles of my jaws hurt. And I realized that it was because I was smiling all the time. I was returning people's smiles 24 hours a day. I took an apartment. I stayed for a couple extra weeks. And then when I started to write mysteries, what I would do is I would get the idea, I'd jot down notes, I'd make some little half-assed outline because I can't actually outline. And then I'd take 8 weeks and I'd build a fence around it so that nobody could bother me. And I'd fly to Thailand. And I'd write the whole book in 8 weeks in Thailand. Still my favorite place to write in the world. So what do I like about it? I like the fact that the Thai people are the best-natured people in the world. They have an enormous sense of fun. There's a word in Thai, sanuk, S-A-N-U-K, sanuk. And sanuk means fun. And it's perfectly appropriate when applying for a job to say that you quit your last job because the workplace lacked sanuk. It wasn't possible to have a good time there. And everybody in Thailand understands that. That's okay.
We don't have that in England.
No, we don't have it here either. But it's very important to the Thais to have a good time. They have a very Buddhist sense of life, and if you're having a good time, you're probably not being harmful. You're probably not hurting other people. So that was the first thing that got me. The other thing is that Bangkok itself is one of the most interesting cities in the world. Somerset Maugham said about Monaco, he called Monaco a sunny place for shady people. And that's absolutely true of Bangkok.
Wow, so you've talked a bit about Thailand, and you mentioned that some of the thriller stuff is based on the terrorism, and of course there were bombs in Thailand a few years ago. And so how much of your writing is based on reality, and how much is made up? As in, do you use a lot of research as the basis of your writing?
I don't do any research. Yes, that's stupid. 100 times a day when I'm writing, I'll say, best grossing movie in 1934 to Google. And here comes the answer, and I've got it. That's my research.
Yeah.
The thing with the Fear Artist was quite simply that I stumbled on the Phoenix program. I was unaware that had happened in Vietnam. I was unaware that was the first time that the American Army and the CIA joined forces to do operations together. Up until then, the CIA had provided information, the Army had acted on it. The Phoenix Project, they were like this, the Phoenix program. They went out together, CIA guys and Army people. And the whole idea was that we didn't know who was good and we didn't know who was bad from that perspective. So we just killed them all. I mean, we killed 1,200 people a month on average. Enormously corrupt. People sold their enemies onto the list, et cetera, et cetera. The reason it's interesting to me is that when the planes got flown into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon was tasked, I love using task because it was tasked to come up with a plan, a military plan. And the first thing they dusted off was the Phoenix program. The very first thing, because here you are, you can't tell the combatants from the non-combatants, you've got little villages, you've got zero technology, you've got bad communications. They just put the whole thing back together. When an American drone hits an Afghan teenager, that's the Phoenix program, back at life again. That interested me, and I had read a wonderful book called The Phoenix Program by Douglas Valentine, just a really riveting book. So I thought that in that case, that was worth tying a story to something historical. A lot of what I write actually just comes out of personal situations. What interests me in writing is coming up with some sort of a major problem and having a handful of characters. And my writing process is sort of like think of the problem. Imagine that the book is the surface of a table. Think of the characters as a bunch of marbles and drop them on the table and see where they all roll. And follow them. And what happens is you get 5 or 6 or 7 stories that way. People reacting to different implications or different aspects of whatever the central situation is. Because I write series and the characters know each other, there tend to be connections among the way they roll. But what's interesting to me is watching people confront situations that strip away polite responses and require you to go more deeply inside yourself and then confront what it is in you that came up in response to that situation. And thrillers and mysteries are very good in terms of putting people in extreme situations and following not only the way they react, but the way they react to the way they react, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good question I always think is interesting is, are you the writer as interesting and kind of kick-ass as your protagonists?
Oh, I'm the wuss of the century. I have no physical courage at all. I spent my entire life in school trying to avoid fights. There is a part of me as a result of that never sort of got dusted out and allowed its time in the sun. And I think that's what's writing when my characters get kick-ass. But my characters are frightened an awful lot of the time. I mean, Tom Cruise is never going to play Poke. Tom Cruise is never going to play Junior. They should both be played by some intelligent actor who realizes that doing something dangerous is essentially foolish, but you have no choice. So no, most thriller writers are the mildest. We are the mildest people in the world.
Nicest, loveliest.
Yeah, we're like a pasteurizing influence on all of mankind. It's just our books that are spiky and exciting.
You mentioned who would play Poke and Junior, but of course they've been signed for film and TV. So do you have any actors in mind?
Yeah, when I first thought of Junior, I thought Robert Downey Jr. Oh. Not just because they're both juniors, but because Downey always has this sense of being the smartest person in the room and somebody who may actually be in another movie all the time. You know, I mean, it's always like he's wondering about what's going on in the next room. He's obviously out of the question. But who I really like is Johnny Lee Miller.
Oh, okay.
I think Johnny Lee Miller is one of the smartest actors I ever saw in my life. My wife and I binged out on his first American TV series, Eli Stone, in which week after week after week after week, he just came up with new ways of listening to people. I mean, it's not even what he does, it's the way he reacts. Anyway, wonderful, wonderful actor. I'd love him to play Junior. Poke, when I wrote Poke, I was actually seeing Johnny Depp because Poke is 1/4 Filipina, and he's got the dark hair and the somewhat Asian features, which Depp has, I guess, as a result of his having American Indian heritage.
That's fascinating, because I think when I'm writing, one of the first things I do is always find somebody in my head, who would play that character. And my protagonist, I have Angelina Jolie play Morgan Sierra, like she was in Salt, and the kind of where she's kick-ass, Lara Croft.
Absolutely.
It's
and she does that really, really well. She does kick-ass really well. I have a feeling she's a bit kick-ass.
Yeah, oh, definitely, yeah. So, I guess the other thing to ask, you've got this lovely backdrop of books and things. Are we in your study, and what is your writing kind of situation like?
We are in my study, but if I were to walk around with this thing and point it at various walls, they've all got books on them. Okay. We own so many books that we have an actual shipping container off a cargo ship, which is like 12 feet long and 8 by 8, up on some acreage we own up near the beach in San Luis Obispo that's full of books.
Wow.
My basic writing routine is to sit down every single day for a minimum of 5 hours. I do it at home sometimes. I do it in coffee houses a lot. When I do it in Bangkok, I do it entirely in a chain of coffee houses called Coffee World. One of the nice things about writing in a coffee house is I just go like this and somebody brings you coffee. The other thing is you can look up and steal faces. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of trouble with faces. Yeah. It's funny. All of us can describe unattractive people. We can all describe people who are kind of extreme looking. What's hard is to be individual in descriptions of really attractive people.
Mm.
We all tend to go to the same cliches, you know. But if you got a really attractive man or woman sitting in a bar across from you in a coffee bar, you know, you can really look at that face and figure out what makes it work. Why is it attractive? So that's a big help to me, because faces are a hard thing for me. I don't have a word count. I have an amount of time that I have to spend.
Mm.
I do try. I believe that any book that isn't being worked on actively for a period of time kind of goes feral on you. It becomes very dangerous to get into the cage with it. You know? And I also believe that Haruki Murakami, who's a wonderful Japanese writer, wrote a book called "What I Think About What I Talk About When I Talk About Running."
Running, yeah, it's a great
which is,
book.
Of course,
really good.
I'm
book.
sorry.
Yeah,
and you know what I'm talking about. He talks about when you're doing a long-term endeavor, like running a marathon. What you got to do is you got to create a flywheel in your chest, and you got to get it going, and it'll sustain you. That flywheel is harder to start every single day that you don't start it up again. So I believe that you have to keep your imagination in motion, because if you don't, the book grows distant on you, and then this terrible thing happens, and it looks like a little diorama in a high school with little dusty figures standing in it, and the only way to get anything done is to reach in and move them around, and that, you know, that's no way to write. The other thing is that I believe that Picasso said the smartest thing about creativity I ever heard, which is that inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And I think if the writing day that you skip could be the day that you would have had the idea that would have transformed the book, the idea you've been waiting for 100 pages. So I just think you got to keep your hand in.
So where can people find you and your books?
Well, everything is on Amazon. There are currently, I think, 15 titles on Amazon. Here in America, I'm in all kinds of mystery bookstores. Neither of my books has been picked up for publication, specifically for publication in Great Britain, which really pisses me off. But I'm being good about it. I am translated into a bunch of languages.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, Timothy. That was brilliant.
You've been great, Joanna. I really appreciate this.